and he was then permitted to be the President of the United States. That's the way it works. In 1960, he responded to a letter asking him if he was a Council on Foreign Relations member, and he said that he was. And he said that he was a regular reader of Foreign Affairs magazine, the journal of the Council on Foreign Relations. Strangely, however, his name never showed up on any list, which means one of two things. It means either that Kennedy wanted very much to be a part of this thing and had never been invited, or he was a member in some secretive capacity. We don't know. But the point of it simply is that he wanted to be a part of this Council on Foreign Relations, even to say that he was a member in a letter written on official stationery. He loaded his cabinet, his people, with all kinds of Council on Foreign Relations members, chief of whom were Dean Rusk as Secretary of State, Robert McNamara as Secretary of Defense. These are the two men that planned and mismanaged so horribly the war in Vietnam. There were plenty of others besides. But let's recall that a president is elected early in November and he doesn't take office until late in January. And so there's a period in between there when a newly elected president will go and select his cabinet officers. And John Kennedy did this. And then there was finally a photo session that was arranged, and all the new cabinet officials got together with the president-elect. He still hadn't taken office. And at that photo session, he had to be introduced to several of the people who were in his cabinet. He had never met them, which simply says that somebody picked them for him, somebody behind the scenes, and this is the way things have been going for a long, long time. John Kennedy was responsible for the introduction of a horrendous disarmament program in 1961 called Freedom from War. Freedom from War would have the United States turn over its military to the United Nations. Other nations do the same, and the United Nations end up as the only military force on earth. That program is still in force, although its name has been changed, and it is unfolding. It continues to unfold. John Kennedy was the president when the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba was accomplished. A couple of thousand Cuban patriots were sent ashore and abandoned. And when they were abandoned, a signal had sped throughout Cuba. Other resistance to Castro surfaced, was rounded up. Castro was far more solidified in power as a result of the Bay of Pigs invasion, and continued to cause disruption throughout Latin America, and even later sending many, many troops over to Angola in Africa in order to guard a communist government over there. In 1960, when President Kennedy was elected, his opponent was Richard Nixon, another member of the Council on Foreign Relations. In 1960, at the convention, the Republicans put together a very hard-nosed conservative document for their platform. The platform committee meets for an entire week. There's a weekend between, and then the full convention is held. After the platform had been written and adopted by the Republican convention, candidate Nixon took it, and he went to New York City with it, went to Nelson Rockefeller. They rewrote the platform, made it much more liberal, much more to the liking of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Rockefellers and others. He brought it back and he gave it back to the convention, and he said, this is what our platform will say, and so forth. And there were a lot of people who said, well, now we know more about Richard Nixon than we never knew. Richard Nixon then left California, went to New York City, moved into an apartment in the same building as Nelson Rockefeller, took a job as a lawyer with a Rockefeller law firm and never did any legal work for them, had a very nice salary, and began to prepare for a later run in the presidency of the United States. In fact, in 1967, Richard Nixon wrote an article for the Foreign Affairs magazine, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, and the article's name was Asia After Vietnam. And in it, he called for the United States to enter into negotiations and diplomacy with Red China, which we hadn't done until that point. This was a very, very stark divergence from American positions taken at this time. But Richard Nixon telegraphed his willingness to do this in 1967 in the CFR's magazine, and then after he became president, he carried out his own wish. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson, of course, was now president, Kennedy having been assassinated in November of 1963. We go back in the career of Lyndon Johnson and we see something that's really amazing. And that is that in 1960, after him being named as John Kennedy's running mate, after a bit of feud between the two, and there was no reason why one would pick the other or why one would have anything to do with the other, except somebody above saying, this is the way it will go. In 1960, LBJ ran for the Senate in Texas and the vice presidency of the United States at the same time. Laws in Texas had been changed to enable him to do this. And the Democrat Party in Texas was far more conservative than the Democrat Party in Washington. In fact, some of the positions taken in Texas were diametrically opposed to what the National Democrats were taking. And you would have thought that the press would have had a field day showing the hypocrite that Johnson really was, but not so. It never really amounted to much. He was simply protecting himself, that if he didn't win, if the Democrats didn't win, he would still have a government job and he would still be a powerful influence in the government. He was never himself a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, but he played along with them. He kept their people in power. He brought more of them in. And he, of course, is the man who is the president when the Vietnam War grew to its horrors, to 500,000 men under arms, to hundreds being slain each week. The war in Vietnam, of course, was Rusk and McNamara, a no-win war. Out of it came more government, moral decline, huge deficits, more entanglement in international organizations. It was a Rusk and McNamara war. It was the Council on Foreign Relations. There was a period at one point early in the war where a whole bunch of generals and admirals got together and talked to a reporter. He wrote an article about the Vietnam War, and he quoted many of these generals and admirals as saying that the war can be won in a matter of weeks if they'll simply let us do it. They wouldn't let them do it. They wouldn't let him shoot until they were shot at. They wouldn't let him chase the enemy across the borders. They wouldn't let him go after his real targets. We lost 55,000 men in that horrible thing. We lost 55,000 as well in Korea, even before, under the United Nations flag. But Lyndon Johnson was also responsible for what was called the Great Society programs. That happens to be the other half of the New World Order. New World Order has two elements: world government and economic control of the people through government programs. That's what the Great Society was all about. We saw there the beginning of what became obvious to us, and that was the presentation of false alternatives to the American people. False alternatives regarding Vietnam were support the president's policy, which was totally insupportable, or to pull out and let the communists take control. Well, missing alternative. There was a missing alternative. What was the missing alternative? Win the darn war. Bring the troops home. And, of course, many of the generals and admirals say the way to win the war is not to involve more troops on the ground. That's the worst thing you can do. Pull the troops out, starve out the North Vietnamese, blockade that one seaport, and so on. Well, we move on. We see finally now in 1968, Richard Nixon comes back. He's now again the nominee of the Republicans. The Democrat nominee is Hubert Humphrey, who was vice president to Lyndon Johnson and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So here we again had the American people told they had a choice when they had choice of CFRA or CFRB. Richard Nixon brought 195 members of the Council on Foreign Relations into government positions. One of the chief of those was Henry Kissinger. Elliot Richardson, George Shultz, Harlan Cleveland, and a whole bunch of others. The opening to Red China was accomplished. Wage and price controls were instituted over the American business community. Richard Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency by an executive order, a total violation of all constitutional procedures. First, that there be a federal regulatory agency, and secondly, that it be done, created by a president without Congress having anything to even say about it. He canceled the Soviet Union's Lend-Lease debt, billions and billions of dollars. There was a huge escalation of aid and trade to the communists to not only keep them in business, but to make them a menacing force to try to scare the American people into world government. Then there was the disgraceful close to the Vietnam War. There were people in our country back in that period who said if Vietnam goes, then Laos is going to go, And Cambodia is going to go